So now we're on to theme two, Christianity versus paganism, or the Christian conversion of the Anglo-Saxons. This is the one that's going to take the most time because almost everybody's familiar with Christianity, but not nearly as many of my students are familiar with paganism. And so I've got to do some sort of comparative religion stuff to give you a background. And honestly, when I say everybody's familiar with Christianity, that's not really true. I mean, everybody in America pretty much knows a Christian or two, but the familiarity that writers especially used to expect from their audience with the Bible and Christian ideas and Christian culture is not nearly as present as it was even 10 years ago when I was teaching here at Brentsville before. So we do have to go over some of that stuff. So I've got a little bit of a presentation here for you. You can see some images on the right hand side. That top image is an image of an Anglo-Saxon king being converted to Christianity by a bishop named Paulinus. And underneath you can see the Thor's hammer symbol that the Vikings would have worn, that the old Anglo-Saxons would have believed in comparison to an Anglo-Saxon cross, which is from later in the Anglo-Saxon period. That first one's from around 450. The second one is much more, I think 800 or something like that. So we'll see some of those changes come along. So let's start with talking about Christianity. That's an Anglo-Saxon church from the late Anglo-Saxon period, and of course the Last Supper up there. Just a couple of illustrations to get you through this. So most people, like I said, are familiar with Christianity, and I don't need to go over the whole Christian story. Did I just do that? I don't have to go over the whole Christian story. The basis of it is that there was this guy named Jesus who was the Son of God, and he performed miracles, ultimately was tried by the Romans, a guy named Pontius Pilate, found guilty, put on a cross, and crucified until he was dead. And in the process of being crucified, he took on the sins of everybody who has ever sinned and forgave them for their sins. He died, then he came back to life, and then he ascended to heaven. Of course, he went down to hell and freed some founding fathers of the Jewish religion from hell. And so there's a lot of complicated stuff. But at the end of the day, the ideology behind it is, that you should love your neighbor as yourself, and that by emulating the ideology and behaviors of Jesus Christ, theoretically you become a better person and you make yourself worthy of ascending to heaven in the afterlife and having an eternity of happiness and fellowship, as opposed to if you don't, where you end up down in a place called hell and you end up with eternal torment. And that's sort of the central tenet of the religion. And I think that's enough to go on, that this is the religion of the Romans that they had in England before the Anglo-Saxons invaded, and that a number of monks and priests did not withdraw, did not flee England, and just stayed there. And so they began the process of converting the Anglo-Saxons from their pagan religion to Christianity, and the conversion of the Anglo-Saxons resulted in a large part, in fact, almost entirely in Anglo-Saxon literature, because the only people who knew how to read and write were the Christians. And so literally everything that we have from the Anglo-Saxon period that's written down, all of the literature, in fact, is written from the Christian perspective. And that's going to be important moving forward. So now let's talk about paganism. Paganism is sort of a blanket term. We tend to think of paganism as somehow being in opposition to Christianity, but it's not. Basically, any religion outside of any widely accepted modern religions, usually polytheistic and predating Christianity, we call these paganism. So, for example, there was a Greek paganism. It worshipped a pantheon of gods that you're all familiar with: Zeus and Ares and Aphrodite and Hera, and all of those guys. They were part of Greek paganism. There was also a Roman paganism, which had a bunch of gods that we're familiar with as well, and are almost the same as the Greek gods because they were really just borrowed, but they have new names like Jupiter and Venus and Mars and all those planetary names. And so that those would be pagan religions too. What we're going to be talking about here is Northern Germanic paganism. So we know that the Anglo-Saxons worship the same gods as, say, the Norse or the Germans worshipped before they became in contact with Christianity. And we know this for from a number of reasons. First off, genealogies. If you look at the genealogies of kings of the Anglo-Saxon houses, they trace the lineage back from king to king to king to king, all the way back to almost all of them an original guy. And the original guy is a guy named Woden, Woden. It turns out that Woden is the Anglo-Saxon name for a god called Odin, who, of course, is the god of leadership and the king of the Anglo-Saxon gods. So, and also of the Germanic gods. So we can test it through genealogies, and we know that they worshipped Odin. We also can look at place names. There's a lot of place names in England, in Saxony, in Anglia, and places like that owe their names to various gods or goddesses of the Germanic pantheon. Also, we got the days of the week. I mean, in English, we know our days of the week real well, but where do they come from? Well, obviously, Sunday is named after the sun. That's clear. And Saturday, isn't he named after Saturn? Isn't that, one of the gods of the Roman pantheon? Yeah, that's true. But how about Wednesday? You ever wonder why Wednesday is spelled so weird? Yeah, it's because it's Woden's Day. Wodensday. Why is that weird N in Wednesday? Because originally it was Woden's Day. Of course, Woden's Day is followed immediately by Thor's Day, which of course we call Thursday now. And then it's followed by Frey's Day, which is another one. And Tuesday is Tyr's Day. So we've got all of these days of the week in the English language that actually come from Northern Germanic gods. And that makes sense because we were originally sort of Northern Germanic pagans. That's how the English were. And I say we because I'm totally like 70% English ancestry. I go back to that. So we can look at the days of the week, but if you're still not convinced, you can go with holidays. You look at the major holidays that are celebrated, even with Christianity, that come from Northern Europe and from England in particular, and you see very clearly that we have this influence of Northern Germanic paganism. Christmas is a good one. I mean, like most people know the Christian story of Christmas about, the miraculous birth of Jesus and David and Mary, Joseph and Mary. Yeah, I'm doing well. Joseph and Mary going into Bethlehem, and that kind of a thing. But what does that have to do with Santa Claus and elves and presents? Well, it turns out that there was this holiday called Yule, and I'm not going to get into all the details. You can go and look it up on your own. It's pretty interesting. But there was this holiday called Yule that was an old Northern Germanic holiday, and part of the celebration, Odin, this god, this old god with a big beard, he had a horse called Sleipnir. It was 8-legged and it could fly, and he would fly around and, give gifts to good people. If you saw him flying, though, you died. Just like that, you died, which meant you didn't want to go outside and look up and see Odin going around to give you gifts, or else you'd end up dead. Sound familiar? I mean, I guess Santa Claus isn't going to kill you, but you're not supposed to see him flying around the world. And then, of course, it was a little darker, as everything was back then. Like if you were bad, this demon called Krampus would grab you as a kid and throw you in his sack and take you back to his place where basically you'd be enslaved. And I think that's where the elves come from. Like in the Santa one, they're like all these nice little elves that are making toys for the good little boys and girls. But in the Old Norse one, I guess if you were bad, you ended up being enslaved in basically a sweatshop making the toys for the ones who were good. And that's a little disturbing. But that would be one holiday. Another one would be the Easter, like in the Christian perspective, most people know the Easter story about how Jesus died on Good Friday and then went in a tomb and was resurrected 3 days later, and that's Easter Sunday. And, but what does that have to do with a bunny and eggs? Well, it turns out that the old pagan Germans had this goddess of fertility whose name was Esther, Esther, and she was represented by things that were super fertile, like bunnies and eggs. And so there's this overlay of old pagan ideology onto a Christian holiday. And actually, it's really interesting and I'm giving you more information than I intended to give you, but you can look it up and it's cool. It turns out that there was a pope of the Catholic Church who, when he sent people north to convert people in places like England, he had this directive where he wanted Christian holidays to be put at the same time as pagan holidays, because he knew how people are. If they had the opportunity to celebrate two sets of holidays, they'd totally do it. They'd be like, I want both sets of holidays. But if you make them at the same time, then they have to choose which one to celebrate. And what actually ended up happening over the years was elements that were super fun from the old pagan tradition got put into the holidays for the Christian tradition. And so we still have a lot of those sort of like pagan elements, and sometimes even pagan names and ideas sticking to what are Christian ceremonies. It has to do with the way Europe was converted. It's cool. And, I highly recommend going and checking it out. But this is how we know that the Anglo-Saxons worship the old Germanic pagan gods. Who were the old Germanic pagan gods? Well, I already mentioned Odin and Thor. But yeah, these guys, now if you watch Marvel Comics movies, you might know something about these guys already. They've sort of made a comeback. If you play Skyrim, do people still play Skyrim? I don't know. But if you do that kind of stuff, then you're going to be familiar with a lot of the stuff that I'm already telling you. But it's fascinating stuff, and I highly suggest going and looking it up. Now, a lot of what Marvel does is not necessarily accurate historically. And in fact, everything that we know about the pagan Germanic gods, it all comes from oral tradition. It's told through stories, through generations. And a lot of it is sort of suspect. The primary sources for this information is a pair of books from Iceland. One is called the Poetic Edda, and one is called the Prose Edda, EDDA. You can go look those up too. Turns out that when the stuff was finally written down, it was written down by a Catholic priest in Iceland in like 1300. His name was Snorri Sturluson. And when he wrote it down with like this sort of way, like, look at what these idiots used to believe. So it's definitely this biased account of how the old pagans viewed the world. And it was written in a way almost to sort of look down on or ridicule their old views. And so we can't know for sure how much of it is real and how much of it is not. And that's the problem with having an illiterate culture. And maybe that's a problem with you ended up growing up and being illiterate yourself. There'd be nothing of you to last. There'd be nothing to say what you really believed in or how you lived your life, because others are left to record it for you. So the big four, we want to talk about the big four gods. Now there's lots of gods and goddesses in the pantheon, but the ones that are going to run into the stories that I'm going to tell you today that you need to know to understand the overall sort of logic and plan of Norse mythology are Odin, Thor, Loki, and Balder. So let's start with Odin. Odin is an older god. He's sort of the all-father of the gods. He has a gray beard. He's sort of the Zeus figure, but he's different in a lot of ways from Zeus. He has a gray beard, gray hair. He's got one eye, not like a Cyclops one eye, but like one eye is gone. He's got an eye patch in a lot of images. He's got a pair of ravens that he can talk to and that he sends to spy for him. He's got a pair of wolves that he can talk to and that he can send to spy for him. He lives in a place called Asgard above the earth, where he has a magic throne that he sits on. And when he sits on it, here's another Santa Claus moment, he can hear any conversation that's going on earth and view anything that's going on earth. He has a magic spear that when he throws it, it appears back in his hand. And also, if somebody touches it and talks to him, they have to tell the truth. It forces them to tell the truth or die. And so he's got this magic horse that's got 8 legs called Sleipnir that flies. I think I mentioned that. Also fun facts about Odin. He is all-knowing. He knows how the world is going to end. He knows everything that's ever happened. It's a pretty interesting story, and it has to do with his eye. And I don't want to get too far ahead of myself, but there are these 3 witches down in hell. They're called the Norns, and they're essentially the Fates from Greek mythology. If you remember that Hercules movie, these 3 witches, they have strings, and the strings represent everybody's life, and they have a knife. They each have a knife, and they decide when to cut the string. Historically, one of them, as opposed to the Greek fates, which are named past, present, and future, the Norns are named for how you die. I think one of them is disease, and one of them is age, and one of them is murder. I think those are their 3 names. But anyway, they're waiting for people to die, and they cut their strings. They don't have any eyes. They literally don't have eyes. Like, there's no eye holes in their face, which is super creepy. Anyway, they can't see anything, but they know the future. They know how everything goes. And this is a sort of a trope of ancient cultures, this idea that people who are physically blind have some sort of sixth sense and can see the future. But Odin wanted to know how the future went. And so he went down to confront these Norns, and he was like, tell me the future. And they said, hey, we'll tell you the future, but you have to give us your eye. And so Odin's like, well, I have too. And he just reaches up and he's like, wah! And he rips his eye out and he gives it to them, which actually makes me wonder if the Norse myth of the Norns, of these fates or weirds or whatever you want to call them, whether it predates Greek mythology, because in Greek mythology, if you remember your Perseus story, these three witches share an eye that they use to see out of, but it's never told where that eye comes from. And it's really interesting to me that eye, that gemstone that they look out of, might actually be Odin's eyeball from Norse mythology. It explains that. Anyway, that's how he learns everything. He also becomes sort of all-knowing by hanging himself from a tree by the neck for 9 days. Which is weird. But that's Odin. And I could go on with more Odin stories, but I'm already at 15 minutes and I've got plenty more to say. And hopefully, if any of this stuff interests you, go on Wikipedia, go watch some videos, look some stuff up on YouTube, expand your education. I mean, you're in your own world now, and you can learn what you want to learn, how you want to learn it. So go expand your knowledge on anything I say here that's interesting. Then we've got Thor. Thor is Odin's son, but Thor is not Thor from the Marvel Comics movies, okay? He's not Chris Hemsworth. He is not as attractive. He's super strong. I mean, Thor's main attribute is strength. He's also got this really short temper. He blows up easily at anybody. He's got this hammer called Mjolnir. You don't have to be super virtuous to use it. You just have to be super strong. He has these magic girdles that help him carry it, and he kills giants with it because he enjoys killing, and especially kills giants. In fact, this explains thunder and lightning. The giants are associated with cold, and so whenever the giants are advancing on Asgard, it gets cold like it does before a thunderstorm when the weather's shifting. And then Thor will go and kill them, and the sound of the thunder is Thor hitting a giant with his hammer and murdering him. There's lots of great Thor stories out there, but there's some really interesting and weird and bizarre Thor tidbits. Thor travels around the 9 realms on a magic chariot that's pulled by 2 magic goats. These goats are so magical that they can't die. And so every night, Thor kills them and eats them. And then they reappear the next morning, and he continues on his journey, which is pretty crazy, I think. So that's Thor. Our next god isn't really a god. He's a giant. His name is Loki. He's Thor's sort of blood brother, if you will. He showed up on Odin's doorstep one day, and he was such a beautiful baby that Odin adopted him and promised never to hurt him. Well, it turns out that Loki is a shapeshifter, and so he took on this form of this beautiful baby to make everybody love him, and he became sort of an honorary god. But he is the god of trickery. He's constantly causing problems for everybody. Certainly Marvel got that right. And so he does all kinds of unfortunate things. Also, he could be anything, anywhere. You're walking by a tree. Is it a tree or is it Loki? You know, you walk by a raven. Is it a raven? Is it Odin's raven or is it Loki? You know, I could be Loki right now giving this lecture. You just don't know. And so that's one of the really interesting things about Loki. He's a bit of a spider. He's an instigator. He likes to cause trouble and watch it happen. We all have friends like this. People who just like to, push and wait until something's going to happen and then let it happen and see. And that's Loki. So he's always causing trouble. I'll give you a couple of Loki stories, just sort of for fun, which illustrate his characters. For example, there's one story where Loki and Thor and some human kid are traveling in Jotunheim, the land of the giants, and they all stop for the night, and Thor gets super drunk. Thor's always getting drunk. That's another problem Thor has. Thor gets super drunk, and Loki doesn't drink, but he also gets this younger gentleman drunk. And ultimately, Loki tells this guy that the reason that Thor, before he passes out, he says, hey, you can eat as much of these goats as you want, but don't break their bones. And Loki says to the human, you know why Thor doesn't want you to break the bones? It's because the bone marrow is so delicious and Thor's saving it for himself. Go ahead, why don't you have some? And so this guy breaks the thigh bones of all the of all the goats and eats out the marrow and really enjoys it. But the next morning, the goats come back to life and all their legs are broken and they're like, meh, 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 meh. And so they have to wait until the goats heal by natural process before they can move on with their journey. And of course, Thor is pretty pissed at Loki and at this other guy, and Loki just sort of enjoys it. That's the kind of thing Loki does. I'll tell you a story about Loki and Balder in another minute. Balder is our next of the big four that you need to know. Balder is another son of Woden or Odin. And he is sort of the god of perfection. Balder is so beautiful and perfect and likable, and everybody likes him, and everything he does is sort of glorious and golden. You know, that would be enough by itself to make Loki hate him. But Loki does. Loki hates Balder because everything Balder does is good, and because Balder understands people, and he cares about people, and people like him back, and nobody likes Loki. And so... Loki doesn't like Balder, but here's the problem with Balder. Balder has had a prophecy told about him when he was a baby. It's very much like Achilles. If you read the Greek story of Achilles, the prophecy about Balder is that he's going to be the first of the gods to die. And so his mother is really upset that Balder's going to die. And so she decides to stop him from dying. And she goes around to everything in the world and she makes it swear an oath never to hurt Balder. So she goes up to Stone and she's like, Stone, you must promise never to hurt my son Balder. And Stone's like, okay, I promise. And then she's like, Iron, you must promise never to hurt my son Balder. And Iron's like, sure, I promise. And she's like, Alligator, you must promise not to hurt my son Balder. So she goes around and she gets everything to promise not to hurt Balder, except for whatever reason, mistletoe. I don't know whether mistletoe was just absent the day that she went around and got everybody's promise, or whether mistletoe was like, screw that Balder, I hate him. It doesn't really say, but mistletoe didn't promise to not hurt Balder. But the result of this is that you can't hurt Balder. Like if I walk up at Balder with a boulder and I throw it at him, the boulder's going to stop like an inch from his head and then fall to the ground because it made a promise not to hurt Balder. If I try and hit him with a sword, the sword stops an inch from his body and does not progress to hurt him because the iron made a promise not to hurt Balder. And so Balder's essentially invulnerable. And what this means is that the gods just amuse themselves by throwing things at Balder. And I know that sounds weird, but let's be honest. Like if you were friends with Superman and you couldn't possibly hurt him, wouldn't it be cool one day just to like hang out around the corner with a sledgehammer and wait for him to come and be like, wham! Because what's it going to do to him? And so anyway, the gods amuse themselves by throwing things at Balder. So let me tell you another fun story about Loki. It turns out that Loki was stalking Balder's mom and had taken the shape of, a bird or something. And he's hiding in a tree. And Balder's mom was talking, and she said, yeah, I made everything promise not to hurt my son except for mistletoe. I just, mistletoe didn't make the promise. And Loki's like, oh, really? And so Loki then goes back to Asgard, and he proceeds to fashion a spear out of mistletoe. He spends a lot of time and makes a spear out of mistletoe, and he waits for the next time people are throwing things at Balder. And Balder's got a brother named Hod who is blind and can't see. And Hod is always sad because he can't participate in throwing things at Balder. And so Loki walks up to Hod and is like, Hod, you want to throw something at Balder? I've made this great thing and you could throw it at him and I'll help you aim. I'm such a nice guy. And Hod is like, oh, yeah, that sounds great. And so then Loki puts this mistletoe spear in Hod's hand. And Hod aims it, and Loki helps him aim, and then he throws it as hard as he can at Balder and kills him. And so Balder dies, and the prophecy is fulfilled, and of course Loki has done this thing, for which Loki ends up banished to hell, underneath a snake's venom that's slowly dripping on him, and, it's pretty brutal. But this is the kind of thing Loki does, and it gives you a good sense of the gods. Also, another really important thing that comes out of this is the idea that the gods are not immortal. In a lot of cultures, the gods are immortal, and that's always thrown me off. Like the Greeks. Okay, how is Zeus old? If the gods don't age, how is he old? It doesn't make any sense. Whereas in this one, there's sort of some metrics that help you make sense of it. It turns out that the gods live in Asgard, and they eat these magic golden apples that make them immortal, immune from disease and immune from aging and things like that. From what I gather, when they're in Middle Earth, though, and away from the apples, they age like regular people. And so probably Odin has spent the most time in Middle Earth. and the most time away from the apples and away from Asgard, as opposed to the other gods and goddesses. And they can also die. You're not immune. You're not immortal as a god. You can still be killed with a spear or with a sword. So even though they're immensely more powerful than regular mortals or regular people, they do have to watch out and they do have to worry. And they're locked in a sense in this cosmic battle between good and evil, because they themselves can become victims to it. And so they're sort of allied with humanity in this giant cosmic war in a way that maybe you don't see in some other religions. So I think that's interesting. One other fun couple facts on Loki, and then we'll call it done. The other problem that Loki has is, remember, he's a giant that shapeshifts and spends most of his time in a human form. And he has a wife among the gods, but he also has a wife among the giants. And so he likes to go off and have giant kids. So he has like two families, and one of the families is giant. Whenever he gets together with a giant, bad things happen. So like one of his kids with a giant is an enormous wolf called Fenrir that's trapped down in hell and is ultimately destined to swallow the sun and the moon and bathe the earth in darkness and thereby start the battle of Ragnarok. And he's got another child, which is called Jormungand, which is an enormous snake that goes around the entire world and is eating his own tail and is destined to murder Thor. And so, Loki, he comes up with all the solutions to all of the gods' problems, but he also causes all of the gods' problems, and it's a sort of an interesting situation. Okay, so how does the world look to an Anglo-Saxon? How do they view the world? I mean, our world conception, like nowadays we have science and we understand, like there's the earth and space and it's going around the sun. And like we've got all of this concept of the world. But back before the scientific method, back before anybody could understand things in a scientific way, we thought about things metaphorically. We thought about things in terms of story. And so what is the story by which the old Anglo-Saxons understood the world? Well, this image is not necessarily the image I would draw on the board in my classroom, but whatever. The first thing you need to know is the Anglo-Saxons saw the world in different levels. Human beings, you and I, lived on a sort of plane of existence called Middle Earth. That's where Tolkien took his name. Middle Earth in this map is sort of like right here, Midgard. And then there was an Upper Earth, which is Asgard, which is where the gods live. And then underneath there was Hell and a bunch of other places. And it was all connected by this tree called Yggdrasil, which was a sacred ash tree that was invisible, that you couldn't see. But the tree connected Upper Earth and sort of Middle Earth and Hell in this tiered situation. It held up the dome of the sky. Asgard was up in its branches and Hell was down in its roots, and so on and so forth. So this might help you a little bit. So first off, where does Middle Earth come from? It turns out that according to Norse mythology, there was this enormous giant, absolutely brutally enormous, and his name was Ymir, and he was murdered by Thor, and his corpse is our world. The mountains and the rocks are his bones. Boulders are his teeth. The dirt is his decomposing flesh. The clouds are his brains floating around in the heavens. I mean, and the ocean is his blood. It's a really sort of disturbing idea that we're living on the corpse of a decaying giant. But that is sort of the idea, and it's surrounded by this shoreless sea. So, you have Middle Earth, which is Midgard, which is where people live. And there's sort of four directions on the compass, north, east, south, and west. And if you could cross the shoreless sea, they used to think that the sea had no end to it. But if you sailed north and you just kept sailing north across the ocean, eventually you would hit the land of the ice giants. It's called Jotunheim, giant home. And there were a bunch of ice giants that lived there. And they hated the gods and they hated human beings because, the gods killed their ancient grandfather Ymir, and so they wanted to destroy everybody and everyone, and they wanted to turn the whole world into sort of like an ice palace, frost and ice. Now this makes sense geographically. If you're in Northern Europe and you sail north, you're going to run into cold, and so it explains why it gets colder the farther north you go. East, if you were to travel east, according to them, you would eventually arrive at a place called Svartalfheim, which is like the dark elf's home or the dwarf's home. They thought that east past the ocean was the home of the dwarves. And the dwarves are really interesting in Norse mythology. They're sort of elves, or sort of twisted elves, but they're super good at crafting things. They build weapons and armor and contraptions and all kinds of cool stuff. They also love to trap people with bargains and tricks that don't favor them, that let them get to keep the thing that they built, but also what you were paying for it. And so, like a lot of our sort of fairy stories about like Rumpelstiltskin and things like that are probably old Norse or Northern Germanic stories about dwarves, of Svartalfs, who are tricking human beings. So that's Svartalfheim. They're neither good nor evil. They're sort of indifferent to humanity and humanity's plight. And when Ragnarok comes, that fateful day that's going to destroy everything, they're just going to lock their halls of stone and like weather the storm. Then if you were to go south, you'd come to the land of Muspelheim. If you could sail past the sea, the shoreless sea. By the way, that giant serpent Jormungand, that is Loki's son, it is at the border of the ocean, which is why on all these maps you see at the edge of the map a sea serpent. That sea serpent is Jormungand, and it represents sort of what happens to ships that sail too far away from shore. They get wrecked by the serpent. I would love a horror movie, like a thriller called Jormungand, in which there's this giant serpent out in the ocean that just destroys ships. That would be cool. But anyway, if you could travel south past the edge of the world, past Jormungand, the world serpent, you'd come to Muspelheim, which is a demon's home. It's a land of fire, basically lava and all that kind of stuff. And there are these demons that look very much like Tolkien's Balrog, with flaming swords and whips and wings and all that kind of stuff. And they live down there. And of course, this is explained sort of geographically too. If you're a Viking and you sail south, you're getting closer and closer to the equator, meaning it's getting hotter and hotter. And so it explains sort of geographically what goes on. Now, if you're able to sail west past the setting sun, you arrive at Alphein, which is essentially fairy from legends. It's the elf's home. And the elves, again, are not good or evil, but they like to mess around with people. And so there are lots of elf stories. Elves, for example, love to steal human children to be their slaves, and they leave behind changelings. And this used to be used to explain birth defects and problems like that with kids. They took your good kid and replaced it with, some kind of, thankfully we progressed beyond this ridiculous sort of belief system. But yeah, that would be Alfheim. And of course, time runs differently in Alfheim. So there's all of these great stories about, like some guy who's walking in the forest and he sees a portal. And he's like, sweet, a portal. And he goes through it. And he ends up in fairyland. He ends up in Alfheim, where he finds a bunch of elves having a dinner. And he has dinner with them. And it's the most delightful dinner he's ever had, with the most beautiful music he's ever heard. And he sees this beautiful elf princess. And he and the elf princess get together. And they have the best night they could ever have. And the next morning, he wakes up and says goodbye to his elf princess, walks back. Hey, look, it's the portal I walked through. He goes through the portal. He ends back up in Middle Earth, but 75 years have passed and everybody he knows is dead. They're not evil. They didn't hurt him. It's just, elves. What are you going to do? And the elves don't participate in Ragnarok either. Apparently, they just laugh when they hear that it's happening, and they don't get involved. Yeah, that's sort of the four directions from Middle Earth. If you could travel up, which you can't do, you'd come to Asgard, Upper Earth, where the gods live. The only way to get to Asgard is to travel the rainbow. There's this rainbow bridge, and if you have a magic flying horse, you can get there. And if you have a chariot pulled by magic goats, you can get there. And if you are a Valkyrie and you can turn into a raven, you can get there. But human beings can't travel to Asgard while they're alive. Only their souls can after they're dead. And so that's Asgard, Upper Earth. Now, if you went down into the roots of the tree, you'd come to the place where those Norns live, those three creepy fates. And this place is called Hell. It's ruled by a woman whose name is Hel. That's where we get the modern word Hell, but back then it was spelled with one L. It's sort of the underworld. It's ruled by a woman named Hel, who is another one of Loki's children, because why not? And she's super creepy because half of her face is a beautiful girl and half of her face is a skull. And that is disturbing. And Hell is an unfortunate icy place full of corpses, and with a giant wolf that's been chained up, and with Loki himself in chains for killing Balder. And it's a very creepy and unfortunate place to be. Now, there were 9 realms, and if you count very carefully, we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 here. So there are 3 realms that I didn't bother to go over: Vanaheim, Niflheim, and Nidaval. I don't even know how to say that one. You don't need to know, but it turns out that there were 2 groups of gods, the Vana and the Aesir, and the Aesir won a war and they set up Asgard, and so that's the powerful place where the gods live. And Vanaheim is sort of where the gods who lost the war live, and they're not super important. They're associated with nature and growth and fertility and stuff like that. And Niflheim is sort of a land of cold fog, where you can just sort of get lost forever. And Nidavellir is a realm of chaos and darkness. And they don't really come into the story in a meaningful way, and so I just sort of left them out. This is one of the things that I guess I should mention. I'm already at 35 minutes into this lecture. I apologize. But one of the things I should mention is that if you read the Eddas, if you go back to the original source material, which I've done, none of this makes sense. It's like a giant plate of spaghetti, and all of the noodles go in all different directions, and sometimes they cross over each other, and sometimes they don't. And I'm trying to make it logical for you. I'm going through this and trying to give you the really important stuff so that you get a concept of what the Anglo-Saxons believed in 450 AD, so you can understand their culture and their understanding of the world and how it was changing as they became Christian. So let's talk really quickly. I got some cool imagery here about the central question of a lot of religions, which is, a lot of religions are trying to answer the question of what happens to you when you die. Christianity gives you that nice, simple, like you can go to heaven or you can go to hell. In the Middle Ages, there was also a place called Purgatory, which we don't talk about anymore. But if you lead a good life and you do things right, you're going to get to have paradise by going to heaven. If you lead a bad life and do things wrong, you're going to go to hell and have eternal torture and torment. And it's very similar. It's very binary as well in Norse mythology. So in Norse mythology, you can either go to Valhalla, which is up in Asgard with the gods, or you can go to hell, which is in the underworld with that goddess Hel. You can see her picture down here, and those 3 Norns. Here they are, the 3 fates. And there's Fenrir the wolf, who's going to swallow the sun and the moon and bathe the world in darkness and start the end of the world. So how do you end up in Valhalla versus hell? What is the criteria? It's actually very simple. It turns out that in Northern Germanic mythology, if you die with a weapon in your hand, you go to Valhalla. If you don't die with a weapon in your hand, you go to hell. So how do you get to Valhalla? It turns out that if you die with a weapon in your hand, these warrior women will take the shape of ravens or crows. They will fly down from Valhalla to pick the soul out of your body and then fly it back up to Valhalla, where you will materialize in Valhalla. And I'll talk about what Valhalla is in a second, but the interesting element of this, I think, is that, like, let's say there's a giant battle and everybody is dead and there's like corpses all over the ground. Well, the first thing that's going to happen is you're going to have a bunch of ravens. You're going to have a bunch of carrion birds come and start picking at those corpses. And for us in our modern society, that's super gross. But if you're a pagan Anglo-Saxon, you'd be like, shh, it's the Valkyries. It's a solemn moment. They're taking the souls of the slain up to Valhalla. And that's pretty cool. So Valhalla is a giant mead hall existing up in Asgard. It's got a ridiculous number of doors. It's enormously big. Anybody of any culture who's ever died with a weapon in their hand has materialized in Valhalla. It's not a culture where you have to believe in Odin to show up in Valhalla. All you have to do is just have a weapon in your hand and you're there. So, not only do you have all the great Norse warriors, Sigmund and Siegfried and Beowulf and, all of those guys, but you also have like Leonidas and the 300 Spartans. And you also have, like Gilgamesh and all of the guys from all of the cultures that have ever died in battle. They've all materialized up there. And life in Valhalla is pretty sweet. It turns out that every morning you wake up, you have breakfast, then you put on your armor and get out your weapon and sharpen it. And then you step out the door of Valhalla onto this giant plain called Vigrid, the plain of battle. Somebody bangs a gong and you kill each other. There's an enormous battle that lasts all day long. And as the sun is setting, literally everybody is dead except for like 2 or 3 people that are standing on top of like a 15 feet deep pile of corpses fighting each other. And then somebody bangs the gong again and you all go, you all revive. You're healthy. You go inside, you take off your armor, and you have a party. You drink as much as you want to drink. You eat as much as you want to eat. You sing, you dance, you have fun, and then you pass out in a state of inebriation. And in the morning, a gong bongs again, and you get up and you put on your armor and you go out and you do it again. And that's eternity in Valhalla. It's a warrior culture with a warrior philosophy, and their heaven is literally just killing people all day in a giant, never-ending series of battles. I say never-ending, but it is ending. We'll get to that. So, cool. What happens if you go to hell? Well, let's say I die without a weapon in my hand. They bury me, and theoretically my corpse slowly sinks down through the earth until it pops out into the underworld, where literally you just freeze in a glacier. So you're like a half-decomposed, zombified corpse frozen in a glacier for all eternity. And you're conscious, and it's cold and miserable, and you can't do anything because you're frozen. That's what it's like in hell. So obviously people want to get to heaven, but this is uniquely unsatisfying from a Christian perspective. I mean, you don't have to be a good person to go to heaven. You don't have to do anything right to make it to Valhalla. You just die with a weapon in your hand and you're there. I mean, what if you're some sort of a horrible Hitler kind of human being and you die with a weapon in your hand and you go to Valhalla? That's not fair. I want it to have some sort of poetic justice. Well, it doesn't. Although maybe it does, because let's be honest. Imagine you're some sort of evil Hitler kind of guy, and you end up in Valhalla. I gotta figure like every day, there's all the greatest warriors of all time, and they're like, hey, there's Hitler. They're gonna make it miserable for you up there in Valhalla. They're gonna kill you in the most painful way possible, day in and day out for all of eternity. So maybe there is a little bit of poetic justice there. However, what if you're this great person who's lived this wonderful life and you just happen to be disarmed before you get killed? Well, then you're in hell, and that's uniquely unsatisfying too. So from a moral perspective, from a perspective that we're used to looking at, I think it is troubling. I think it is difficult to think about. But yeah, here's your sort of picture of hell down here versus heaven up there, Valhalla versus hell. So let's move on. Let's talk about Ragnarok. Ragnarok literally translates into the doom of the gods, and it is the judgment day in pagan mythology. And it's really fascinating too. So it's an inevitability. It's going to happen according to Norse mythology. In the Eddas, there's a song called the Volupsa, which is sort of the story of what's going to happen in Ragnarok, and the fates know it, and Odin knows it, and so it has now been told, and people know it. They know the inevitable outcome. So what happens? Well, eventually the day of Ragnarok is going to happen. And how does it happen? Well, it turns out that down in hell, among other disgusting things that's happening down there, that they've been building this giant longship, like this absolutely enormous ship. And the ship is being constructed out of, wait for it, dead men's fingernails. Yeah, I don't make these things up. And actually, pause. It's easy to laugh at this stuff. You're like, wait, what? They're making a ship out of dead men's fingernails? That's kind of like plastic, I guess. But it sounds ridiculous, and it's easy to laugh at it, and it's easy to think, like, what did these people used to believe, and how did they used to believe it? Were they that dumb? And I think before we start running down that road, it's a lot easier when nobody believes in things anymore to look at them and be like, hey, that's super dumb. And how did you believe that, you idiot? But it's a lot harder to feel that way when people that you know and respect and you grow up with believe that thing. Because then you've grown up hearing it and seeing people that you respect believing it. And certainly that would have been the case for all the old Anglo-Saxons. Their uncles and their fathers and their sisters and, all of these people would have believed it. And it's much harder to scoff at something when you live in that sort of a matrix where the thing is still alive in the hearts and minds of the people, which it isn't today. So it's really easy to look at it with disdain. But remember, all of these are metaphors to try and explain life and why things are the way they are. Like that world serpent. Let me give you an example. That world serpent, that giant snake, Jormungand, it's going around the entire world, and it's eating its own tail, and it's always angry and it's always hungry. And when it's angry and it's hungry, it wriggles. And when it wriggles, it creates waves, which explains why the waves are always coming in and hitting the shore. So like all of these things exist to prove various elements of the world and why the world is the way it is and why people act the way that they do. Anyway, Ragnarok. So eventually down there in hell, they're going to finish this giant ship, Naglfar, made out of dead men's fingernails. And when the ship is finished, a series of events is going to happen. Loki is going to break free from his imprisonment, and he's going to be pretty bitter from being down there for 1,000 years, slowly poisoned by a snake. He's going to set his son Fenrir the wolf free. The wolf is going to leap into the sky, going to swallow the sun and the moon and bathe the world in darkness. As that happens, all of the ice in hell is going to melt, and all the zombie corpses of everybody who's ever died without a weapon in their hand, which of course includes like babies and, you know, people who died in childbirth and all kinds of creepy stuff like that. All of these zombies are going to get on the ship, and Loki is going to pilot the ship, and he's going to sail the ship up to Middle Earth. And as he sails the ship up to Middle Earth, his second son, that serpent Jormungand, is going to uncoil itself from the world and go to join him. And when it does, it's going to allow the 9 realms to invade Middle Earth. All the giants, the ice giants, are going to get together under their leader Grimnir, a giant with 2 heads. And they are going to march down and join Loki. So now we got all of the undead. We've got Loki, we got the giant wolf, we got the giant snake, and all of those giants. And then, of course, from Muspelheim, the demons with their sort of Balrog flaming swords, the fires, they're all going to come and they're going to join him as well. And they are all going to jump on the dread ship Naglfar, which has a magical property that it can sail up the Rainbow Bridge to Asgard. And so the ship is going to sail up the Rainbow Bridge, but as it sails up the Rainbow Bridge, it's so heavy that it's going to destroy the bridge, and little fragments of rainbow, I don't know, Skittles or something, taste the rainbow. They're gonna fall to Earth, and the Rainbow Bridge is going to be destroyed forever. Well, this god named Heimdall, who has a massive horn, is going to see them coming, and he's going to blow the horn, and the gods are going to get together, and they're like, "Oh, here it comes, Ragnarok!" And so the gods are going to outfit themselves for battle, and then Odin is going to go and open the doors of Valhalla, and everybody who's ever died with a weapon in their hand is going to come out and join their army for the fight. So what seemed like a pointless series of combats that went on forever and ever to no end is going to end, but it also turns out that those guys were training every day, all day long, for the inevitable outcome of time. And so not only are they the greatest warriors of all time, but they've been training for an eternity for this day. And so they all come out with their weapons and they all line up. And so on one side, you've got nature, a wolf, a snake, fire, death, ice, all lined up. And on the other side, you've got civilization and humanity, the gods and their great warriors, the Einherjar of Valhalla, and all of the Valkyries lined up to defend Asgard. And they're going to charge. Odin charges down the hill on his 8-legged horse Sleipnir right at the wolf Fenrir, and anticlimactically gets swallowed up and eaten in one bite. But then the battle is engaged on all sides, and at the end of it all, everybody dies. All of the zombies are chopped up. All of the Einherjar of Valhalla are dead. Thor manages to kill the giant serpent Jormungand, but he gets bitten so many times that he's poisoned. I think he staggers back like 7 steps and then falls down dead from the snake poison. I'm trying to remember who. Frey kills the wolf. But then he himself is the last survivor, and the last survivor on the other side is Surt. I think Hod, that blind guy, kills Loki, which I guess is poetic justice, but Loki kills him as well. And so at the end of it all, Frey and Surt, the fire demon, are fighting each other, and they both kill each other. And Surt's sword it's a flaming sword, goes flying out of his hand and like sticks into the world tree, Yggdrasil, and ignites it, and the whole tree catches on fire. And at the end of everything, we just have ashes and no sun and no moon and darkness and a cold wind blowing, and then the credits roll. And it's super intense. Now, in the Eddas, there's another chapter that's added on at the end of this that a lot of historians and people like that think is added on by the author, in which there's one human male and one human female that like hide in the tree branches and survive the fire, and they come down and start repopulating the world. And so what they think that is like the Christian author who's telling these Norse stories being like, and then Adam and Eve. And it's unclear whether that was part of the original story or not, but we don't have an original story. All we have is a story the Christian guy wrote down. So you can take that one way or the other, however you want to. But yeah, that's the end of the Norse story. And it really ties in pretty well with some of our other themes. So let's talk about Christianity versus paganism and the conversion of the Anglo-Saxons and what it means to the literature and what you're going to be reading. Because all that was background information, 50 minutes of crazy background information. I'm sorry about that, but I get into stuff, and it is who I am. So at the beginning, if you can read this chart that I just sort of made, here we have 450 AD when the Anglo-Saxons first arrived. Over the other side, we have 1066 when the Anglo-Saxon age ends. At the beginning, like 1% of the population was Christian, and 99% of the population was pagan. By the end, it had switched. And so throughout the middle of the Anglo-Saxon period, you have this time period in which both Christianity and paganism exist simultaneously in the hearts and minds of the Anglo-Saxon people. And Beowulf was written around this time. And a lot of the poems that we're going to be reading were written around this time. And so it's a time period in which both religions hold sway, and they allude to both religions in the story. And so even though the story is written down by the Christians, who were the ones who were able to read and write, it contains a lot of pagan elements, and you have to be able to see those elements. In order to see them, you have to have that foundation of pagan mythological history. And so that's sort of the time period that we're talking about when two religions, two worldviews simultaneously hold sway. One's going up and one's going down, but they're both still very much alive in the hearts and minds of the people. So to bring Christianity versus paganism to sort of a logical close, the only people who could read and write were Christians. So all Anglo-Saxon literature is written from a Christian perspective, and it's inherently anti-pagan. So the goal of these writers, in large part, is to convert people. They're writing these stories, and they're relying on pagan elements, but they're using the pagan elements to make the reader convert to Christianity. So all of these stories have an inherent Christian bias, so much so that their goal is to make you Christian. And it's just sort of how it is in the literature. The pagans were illiterate, and their beliefs were only written down because a Christian Icelandic monk recorded them in the 14th century. So So you got to take that into account when you think through what the purpose of the writings is and how they're going to use various elements. So there's going to be a lot of Christian allusions. They're going to be bold and in your face and very clear. There's going to be pagan allusions, but they're going to be subverted because they don't want to call things out by name, and you have to be a little bit of a detective to sort of see them. But they underscore everything. Yeah, and I think that's certainly enough to go on. But I do want to mention how the first two themes, Christianity versus paganism and civilization versus nature, sort of dovetail. If you're looking at them carefully, you say to yourself, wait a second. In Christianity versus paganism, Christianity is a force for order and light, and it's going to be victorious. But in civilization versus nature, civilization is a force for order and light, but it's going to be defeated. How does this work? Well, it turns out that that Christianity offers an escape to sort of the brutal realism of paganism. At the end of that pagan mythology, it's dust and ashes and darkness, and there is no victory. But in Christianity, there's this idea of eternal life in heaven. And so the Anglo-Saxons rationalize these two things. They say, yes, you're going to die. Your body's going to decompose. Nature's going to win. Nature's going to win physically, but emotionally and in terms of the human soul, you have victory, and the victory actually is death. If you die believing, then you go on to heaven and you've ascended beyond this mortal life. If you're a pagan, you're trapped here in this mortal life. There's no escape from this realm. And so that's sort of how that all works, and it makes some sense. The thing that really melts my brain about all of this, though, when it all comes down, is Odin. I mean, if Odin knew how everything was going to turn out, then he rode down that hill on his horse straight at the wolf to be killed, and he knew he was going to die. He trained the Einherjar of Valhalla, even though he knew they couldn't possibly win. And I think this says something about Anglo-Saxon beliefs, the pagan belief. It wasn't about winning. Christianity offers an option to win. It offers a hope of eternal happiness. But for the Anglo-Saxons, it wasn't about winning. You were going to lose. It was about the fight that you put up. And Odin teaches us that the fight you put up matters more than the outcome of the fight itself. So I'm going to call this lecture over. We're going to move on to exile in my next one. Sorry for the length of it, but I think hopefully this gives you a grasp on Anglo-Saxon culture in a way that you wouldn't have had otherwise, and helps you maybe understand the poems and the literature in a stronger way.